The infrared drone footage showed exactly what Captain Aria Bennett had feared: a heavily fortified compound in the mountains of northern Myanmar, surrounded by triple perimeter fencing, guard towers at each corner, and thermal signatures indicating at least 40 hostile fighters patrolling the grounds. In the center building, isolated in what appeared to be a basement cell, was a single heat signature that intelligence had identified as Colonel Marcus Reeves, captured 3 days ago during a reconnaissance mission gone wrong. Aria studied the footage in the secure briefing room at the forward operating base, her green eyes tracking every detail of the compound's layout. She was 30 years old, 5'7", with dark blonde hair currently pulled back in a tight tactical braid, and a lean, athletic build that came from years of specialized training in infiltration and close-quarters combat. For the past 6 years, she'd been part of a classified unit that conducted operations conventional forces couldn't: deep penetration reconnaissance, high-value target extraction, and missions that officially never happened. The mission commander, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Morrison, stood at the front of the room with a laser pointer, highlighting key features of the compound. Colonel Reeves has been held for 72 hours. Intelligence suggests he's being interrogated for information about our operations in the region. We have a narrow window, maybe 48 hours, before they either move him or his intelligence value leads to compromised operations. Morrison paused, then continued with obvious reluctance. The problem is accessibility. The compound is positioned in mountainous terrain with limited approach routes. Any conventional assault would be detected long before we reach the perimeter. Air insertion would alert every hostile force in a 50-kilometer radius. This requires a different approach. She looked directly at Aria. Captain Bennett, you've been read into the specialized infiltration protocols. Your assessment? Aria stood, approaching the display showing the compound layout. She'd been expecting this. Her unique skill set made her the only viable option for this type of operation. Solo infiltration is feasible. The terrain provides covered approaches if you know how to use it. The guard rotation patterns show predictable gaps. The perimeter security is designed to stop vehicles in large forces, not a single operator moving on foot through difficult terrain. What's your success probability? Morrison asked. For infiltration? 90%. For successful extraction of a high-value target from a fortified position while evading 40 hostile fighters? Aria paused, running the tactical calculus in her head. 50%, maybe less. A lot depends on the colonel's physical condition and whether they've anticipated a rescue attempt. Morrison nodded slowly. That's honest. Most officers would inflate those numbers. The decision-makers want better odds. Then they should send a full assault team with air support and accept the casualties and political fallout, Aria replied bluntly. Or they can send me alone with minimal signature and hope that superior training and planning beat superior numbers. There was a long silence. Finally, Morrison spoke. You're authorized for solo infiltration and extraction. Mission launch in 4 hours. You'll have overwatch support from drones and satellite, but no direct fire support. If you're compromised, extraction will be nearly impossible. Understood, ma'am. After the briefing, Aria spent 2 hours in detailed mission planning, memorizing every aspect of the compound layout, studying the terrain, identifying primary and alternate extraction routes. She reviewed the guard rotation patterns captured by surveillance drones, noting the predictable gaps in coverage during shift changes. She studied the building layouts, identifying structural weaknesses and potential entry points. Then came equipment selection. For an operation like this, every ounce mattered. She couldn't carry standard assault gear, too heavy, too visible, too noisy. Instead, she selected a suppressed Sig Sauer P226 pistol, 3 spare magazines, a combat knife, climbing equipment, breaching charges, night vision equipment, communication gear, and a small medical kit. Total weight, 32 pounds, distributed across a custom low-profile tactical vest and drop-leg pouches. The insertion happened at 0230 hours. A helicopter dropped Aria 8 kilometers from the target compound, landing just long enough for her to roll out before disappearing back into the night sky. She was alone in hostile territory with a 48-hour window to infiltrate a fortified position, locate and extract a captured colonel, and escape through terrain controlled by hostile forces. Most people would have found the isolation terrifying. Aria found it liberating. No one to coordinate with, no one to worry about, no one whose mistakes could compromise the mission. Just her skills, her training, and her determination to bring Colonel Reeves home. She began moving through the mountainous terrain with practiced efficiency, using night vision to navigate the difficult ground while avoiding obvious routes that might be observed or booby-trapped. The first 3 kilometers took 90 minutes, slow progress but necessary to avoid detection. She moved like a ghost through the landscape, using natural cover, staying in shadows, pausing frequently to listen and observe. At the 5-kilometer mark, she encountered her first obstacle, a small patrol of 3 fighters moving along a trail that intersected her route. She went to ground in dense vegetation, controlling her breathing, remaining absolutely motionless as they passed within 10 meters of her position. One of them stopped to light a cigarette, so close she could hear the flick of his lighter and smell the tobacco smoke. After what felt like an eternity, they moved on. She continued toward the compound, adjusting her route based on what she observed. The intelligence briefing had been accurate about the terrain, but reality always differed from satellite imagery. She identified and avoided 2 observation posts that hadn't been in the briefing materials, taking wide detours that added an hour to her approach, but kept her undetected. At 06:15 hours, as dawn began to break over the mountains, Aria reached a concealed observation position approximately 400 meters from the compound. She settled in, making herself invisible in the natural terrain, and began detailed reconnaissance of the target. The compound was exactly as described, 3 buildings arranged in a rough triangle, surrounded by triple chain-link fencing topped with razor wire, 4 guard towers, and numerous roaming patrols. She counted 32 visible hostiles during her first hour of observation, confirming intelligence estimates of 40 total fighters. Through her spotting scope, she studied the guard patterns, timing their movements, identifying blind spots in their coverage. The compound had been designed to defend against external assault, but the designers had assumed attackers would come in vehicles or large groups. They hadn't anticipated someone who could approach through terrain they considered impassable, who could exploit gaps in coverage measured in seconds, who had the patience to wait for the perfect moment. Aria spent the entire day observing, making detailed notes, mapping out exactly how she would execute the infiltration. She ate cold rations, drank water sparingly, and used a makeshift camouflage net to avoid detection by passing patrols. Twice, hostile fighters came close enough that she could hear their conversations in Burmese and Chinese, but neither group spotted her position. As evening approached, she reviewed her plan one final time. The infiltration would happen during the guard shift change at 0200 hours, the period of maximum confusion when outgoing guards were tired and incoming guards were still adjusting to darkness. She had identified a section of fence between 2 guard towers where the overlapping fields of fire created a gap that lasted approximately 45 seconds during the shift transition. 45 seconds to cross 400 meters of open ground, breach the fence, and reach cover near the main building. Impossible for most people. For Aria, with her training and physical conditioning, barely feasible if everything went perfectly. At 0145 hours, she began her final approach. The night was moonless, which helped concealment but made navigation more difficult. She moved with absolute silence through the remaining terrain, using night vision to avoid obstacles, timing her movements to coincide with guard rotations. At 1:58 hours, she was in position at the edge of the cleared area surrounding the compound. Through her night vision, she could see guards in the towers preparing for shift change, others walking the perimeter. She controlled her breathing, calmed her heart rate, and waited for her window. At 0200 hours exactly, the shift change began. Guards shouted to each other, flashlights swept in predictable patterns, and for a brief moment, the security system that had seemed impenetrable showed its weakness. Aria moved. She crossed the open ground in a dead sprint, covering distance with speed that came from years of training. 30 seconds gone. She reached the fence, pulled out wire cutters, and began working on the chain link with practiced efficiency. The cutters had been specially modified, sharper, stronger, quieter. 40 seconds gone. She created an opening just large enough to squeeze through, pulled herself into the compound, and immediately went to ground behind a storage shed near the main building. 44 seconds. She'd made it with 1 second to spare before the guard patterns re-established. Now came the hard part. She stayed frozen behind the shed, listening to footsteps as a guard patrol walked past less than 5 meters away. She could hear them talking casually, completely unaware that an American special operations officer had just infiltrated their supposedly secure compound. When they passed, she moved to the main building's exterior wall and began working her way around the perimeter, staying in shadows, using every piece of cover. Through a window, she could see the building's interior, sleeping quarters on the first floor, what looked like offices or planning rooms on the second floor, and according to intelligence, a basement level where prisoners were held. She found what she was looking for, a ventilation grate near the building's foundation that led to the basement level. The grate was secured with 4 bolts that would make noise if removed conventionally. Instead, she applied a specialized lubricant, waited 30 seconds for it to penetrate the threads, then carefully removed each bolt with a tool designed for silent operation. The grate came free. She slid it aside, squeezed through the opening, barely large enough for her slender frame, and dropped down into the basement level of the building where Colonel Reeves was being held. The basement was dark, dank, and smelled of mold and human suffering. Aria pulled out her suppressed pistol and moved through the corridor with her weapon up, her night vision showing the way. She passed several empty cells, then heard a sound. Labored breathing, someone conscious but trying to remain quiet. She reached the last cell and saw him. Colonel Marcus Reeves sitting against the far wall, hands zip-tied behind his back, face showing the evidence of interrogation, but eyes alert and focused. When he saw her, his expression shifted from surprise to controlled relief. Aria quickly checked the corridor, then approached the cell door. It was secured with a heavy padlock, but she'd come prepared. She pulled out a small-shaped charge, just enough explosive to blow the lock without alerting the entire compound, placed it carefully, and stepped back. The charge detonated with a muffled crack, louder than she'd hoped, but not catastrophic. The lock shattered, and she pulled the door open. "Colonel Reeves, Captain Aria Bennett, I'm here to extract you." Reeves stood with difficulty, his legs clearly stiff from days of captivity. "About damn time," he said quietly, then grimaced. "Sorry, Captain. Glad to see you." She cut his zip ties with her knife and handed him a small pistol from her kit, a backup weapon that might make the difference if they encountered resistance. "Can you move? We have approximately 10 minutes before someone investigates that explosion." "I can move. Might not be pretty, but I can move." They exited the cell and began moving back through the basement corridor. Aria led, weapon up, checking corners, moving with tactical precision. Behind her, Reeves followed as quietly as his condition allowed. They were halfway to the ventilation grate when the situation deteriorated. Voices echoed from the stairs leading down to the basement, guards responding to the explosion, coming to investigate. Aria made a split-second decision. "This way," she whispered, pulling Reeves into a small side room filled with maintenance equipment. They pressed themselves against the wall as footsteps pounded past their position. 2 guards, maybe 3, moving toward the cell area. Shouting started when they discovered the blown lock and empty cell. "They know you're gone," Aria whispered to Reeves. "Original extraction plan is compromised. We need an alternate route." She pulled out a small tablet showing the compound layout. "There's a vehicle depot on the north side of the compound. If we can reach it, we can steal transport and ram through the perimeter fence." "That's a terrible plan," Reeves observed. "You have a better one?" "No, let's do it." They moved back into the corridor, but now the basement was filling with guards responding to the alarm. Aria knew they had minutes, maybe seconds, before being trapped. She led Reeves toward a stairwell leading up to the first floor, moving fast but trying to maintain stealth. They reached the stairs just as a guard came running down. There was no time for quiet solutions. Aria's suppressed pistol cracked twice, controlled pairs to the chest, and the guard dropped without making a sound. She caught his body, eased him down to avoid noise, and kept moving. The first floor was chaos, guards running toward the basement, others taking defensive positions, officers shouting orders in multiple languages. Aria and Reeves moved through the confusion, keeping low, using the panic to their advantage. In the darkness and chaos, two figures in tactical gear didn't immediately register as threats. They reached a rear exit and slipped outside into the compound yard. The vehicle depot was 50 meters away, a collection of trucks and utility vehicles parked in a covered area. Between them and the vehicles were at least a dozen hostile fighters who'd taken up defensive positions, anticipating an external assault. "We need a distraction," Reeves said quietly. Aria pulled out a smoke grenade, one of two she'd carried for exactly this situation, and threw it toward the main gate on the opposite side of the compound. It detonated with a loud pop, producing dense white smoke that billowed across the compound yard. Guards immediately shifted toward the smoke, believing it was the main assault. In the confusion, Aria and Reeves sprinted toward the vehicle depot. They reached it undetected, and Aria immediately went to work on a large military truck that looked fast and durable enough to ram through fencing. "You know how to hotwire a truck?" Reeves asked. "Among other skills," Aria replied, already working on the ignition wires. 15 seconds later, the engine roared to life. They climbed in, Aria behind the wheel, Reeves in the passenger seat with his borrowed pistol ready. She threw the truck into gear and stomped on the accelerator, heading straight for the compound's north fence at maximum speed. Hostile fighters realized what was happening and opened fire. Bullets sparked off the truck's body and shattered windows. Aria kept her foot down, aiming for the fence section between two guard towers. The truck hit the chain link at 60 kilometers per hour. The fence exploded outward in a screech of torn metal and snapping posts. The truck burst through, airborne for a moment as it hit the uneven ground beyond the perimeter, then landed hard and kept accelerating. Behind them, the compound erupted in chaos. Vehicles started up in pursuit, guards fired rifles at the fleeing truck, and spotlights swept the darkness trying to track their escape. Aria drove like she was racing for both their lives, which she was. The truck bounced and slid over rough terrain, engines screaming, Reeves holding on to whatever he could grab while simultaneously returning fire at pursuing vehicles through the shattered rear window. "How's our extraction looking?" Reeves shouted over the engine noise. "About 3 kilometers ahead if we can lose pursuit," Aria replied, wrestling with the steering wheel as the truck hit a particularly rough section. They couldn't lose pursuit. 3 vehicles were chasing them, closing the distance despite Aria's aggressive driving. The terrain was too rough for sustained high speed, and the pursuers knew the area better. Aria made a decision. "Hold tight," she shouted, then deliberately swerved the truck off the rough trail they'd been following and into even more difficult terrain, a steep downslope covered in loose rock and vegetation. The pursuing vehicles tried to follow, but the lead truck lost control on the loose terrain and rolled, taking out a second vehicle in the collision. The third pursuer backed off, unwilling to risk the dangerous ground. Aria fought to control their truck as it slid down the slope, but physics won. They hit a large boulder, the truck spun sideways, and suddenly they were rolling, once, twice, 3 times before coming to rest on its side in dense vegetation. For a moment, there was only silence broken by the tick of cooling metal and the distant shouts of their pursuers. Then Aria moved, shoving open the driver's door and pulling herself out. She was bruised, bleeding from multiple cuts, but functional. "Reeves, can you move?" she called down into the overturned truck. "Yeah," came the response, strained but alive. "Yeah, I'm coming." She helped pull him from the wreckage. He'd taken additional damage in the crash, but was mobile. They stumbled away from the truck into the dense vegetation just as the distant pursuers began working their way down the slope on foot. Aria pulled out her communication device and activated the emergency beacon. "Overlord, this is Nightingale. Primary extraction compromised. Activating emergency beacon. 2 personnel. Hostile pursuit need immediate evacuation." The response came immediately. "Nightingale, Overlord copies. We have your beacon. Extraction inbound. ETA 12 minutes. Can you hold that long?" Aria looked at Reeves, assessed their ammunition, considered the terrain and the pursuing hostile forces. "We'll have to." They moved away from the crash site. putting distance between themselves and the wreck before finding a defensive position in rocky terrain that provided cover and overlapping fields of fire. Aria had 3 magazines remaining for her pistol. Reeves had 1. Not much for a sustained firefight, but enough if they were smart. The hostile fighters reached the crash site and began spreading out, searching the surrounding terrain. Aria counted 8 hostiles, all armed with assault rifles and moving with tactical proficiency. These weren't random fighters. They were trained soldiers who knew how to search for and engage targets. She and Reeves stayed absolutely still in their concealed position, controlling their breathing, using every bit of cover the terrain provided. The hostile fighters moved closer, calling out to each other, coordinating their search pattern. One fighter came within 5 meters of their position, close enough that Aria could see his face clearly through her night vision. Her finger rested on the trigger, ready to engage if discovered, but the fighter's attention was focused elsewhere. He turned away, moving toward another section of terrain. The minutes dragged by with agonizing slowness. Aria's communication device showed the extraction helicopter closing. 10 kilometers, 8 kilometers, 5 kilometers. But the hostile fighters were still searching, and if they were still in the area when the helicopter arrived, the extraction would turn into a firefight. At 4 kilometers out, one of the hostile fighters spotted something, blood on vegetation from their injuries. He shouted to his companions and pointed directly toward Aria and Reeves's position. "We're compromised," Aria said quietly. "When they come, we engage hard and fast, then displace toward the extraction point. Make every shot count." The hostile fighters began moving toward their position in a coordinated assault formation. Aria let them close to effective pistol range, then opened fire. Her first shot dropped the lead fighter. Her second and third took down 2 more before they could seek cover. Reeves engaged simultaneously, his borrowed pistol cracking in controlled pairs. The hostile fighters scattered, returning fire, but the surprise engagement had disrupted their attack. "Move!" Aria shouted, and they began displacing toward the extraction point, moving through difficult terrain while the hostile fighters regrouped and pursued. It became a running firefight through the darkness. Move, shoot, move again. Aria's ammunition was running low. She was down to her last magazine when she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotor blades. The extraction helicopter came in fast and low, a UH-60 Black Hawk with door gunners who immediately opened fire on the pursuing hostile fighters with mounted machine guns. The suppressive fire was devastating, forcing the hostiles to seek cover and breaking their pursuit. The helicopter touched down in a small clearing, and Aria and Reeves sprinted the last 50 meters to reach it. Hands pulled them aboard, the door gunners maintained covering fire, and the helicopter lifted off even as bullets sparked against its armored hull. They were airborne, gaining altitude, putting distance between themselves and the hostile forces. Aria collapsed against the helicopter's interior wall, adrenaline finally giving way to exhaustion. Across from her, Colonel Reeves was receiving medical attention from the helicopter's medic, but he caught her eye and nodded. Acknowledgement between professionals who'd just survived something that should have killed them. The debriefing lasted 6 hours, with Aria recounting every detail of the infiltration, extraction, and escape. Intelligence officers wanted to know about compound layout, guard procedures, hostile force capabilities, anything that might be useful for future operations. When it was finally over, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison pulled her aside. "Captain Bennett, I've been doing this job for 20 years, and what you did, solo infiltration of a fortified hostile compound, successful extraction of a high-value prisoner, and escape through hostile territory while pursued by superior forces, that's the kind of operation that becomes legend in our community." Aria was too tired for modesty. Did the colonel have useful intelligence? He'd been resisting interrogation, but he had information about hostile force movements that we needed. Your extraction prevented that intelligence from being compromised and saved lives. Morrison paused. "You understand this operation will never be publicly acknowledged. No medal ceremony, no official recognition. I know how classified operations work, ma'am. But I wanted you to know, from someone who understands what it takes to do what you did, you're one of the finest operators I've ever seen." Aria nodded. "Thank you, ma'am." 3 days later, after mandatory medical evaluation and psychological debriefing, Aria was back at her regular duty station, preparing for the next mission. The compound Infiltration had already become a classified legend within the special operations community. The solo operator who'd penetrated a fortified position, extracted a captured colonel, and fought her way through hostile territory to successful extraction. But for Aria, it was just another mission, another impossible situation that had required every bit of her training, skill, and determination. Another reminder that sometimes the most dangerous operations required not the largest force, but the right operator with the courage to go alone into hostile territory and do what needed to be done. Colonel Reeves recovered fully from his captivity and returned to duty. He never forgot the night a single special operations officer had infiltrated enemy territory to bring him home. Years later, when asked about the most impressive operator he'd ever worked with, he always mentioned Captain Aria Bennett, the woman who'd come alone into hell and walked out with what everyone thought was impossible. Because that's what the best operators do. They don't wait for permission or perfect conditions. They don't require overwhelming force or guaranteed success. They assess the situation, make a plan, and execute with absolute commitment. They go where others can't or won't, do what others believe is impossible, and accomplish the mission despite overwhelming odds. Aria Bennett had done exactly that. And though the operation would remain classified for decades within the special operations community, her name became synonymous with courage, skill, and the kind of operational excellence that defined the very best warriors. She'd infiltrated solo through enemy territory. Then she'd done something they would never forget. She'd taken back one of their own, against impossible odds, through skill and determination that proved sometimes the most dangerous weapon on any battlefield is a single operator who refuses to accept failure. The wolf doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wait for reinforcements or perfect conditions. It simply does what wolves do when the pack needs protecting. And sometimes, the most effective wolf hunts alone. 6 months after the operation, Aria was conducting training for a new class of special operations candidates when Colonel Reeves visited the facility. He stood at the back of the classroom while she taught advanced infiltration techniques, watching her demonstrate the same skills that had saved his life. After the class ended, he approached her. "Captain Bennett, I wanted to thank you properly, away from the debriefings and official channels." Aria looked at him, seeing not the captured prisoner she'd extracted, but the experienced officer who understood what it meant to depend on someone else for your survival. "You would have done the same for me, sir." "Maybe. But I've been thinking about that night, about what it took for you to come alone into that compound. The courage isn't just physical. It's the willingness to accept that if something went wrong, no one could save you. That kind of isolation requires a different level of strength." "It's the job, sir." Reeves smiled slightly. "That's what the best operators always say. But I've recommended you for the Medal of Honor. It won't be approved because the operation is classified, but your actions deserved recognition at that level. What you did, infiltrating solo, breaching a fortified compound, extracting a prisoner, and fighting through hostile territory, that's the kind of courage that defines a generation of warriors." Aria felt the weight of his words, but remained focused on what mattered. "The important thing is you made it home, sir. Your intelligence prevented further casualties and helped close down their operations in that region. That's the real success. The mission succeeded because you refused to accept failure," Reeves corrected. "Because when everyone else saw impossible odds, you saw a problem that needed solving. That's what separates good operators from legendary ones." He extended his hand. "Thank you, Captain. For my life, for your courage, and for being exactly the kind of warrior this nation needs but rarely deserves." They shook hands, two professionals who'd faced death together and understood that some bonds transcended rank and formality. As Reeves left, Aria returned to preparing for her next class. There were always more operators to train, more missions to plan, more impossible situations that would require someone willing to go alone into hostile territory and do what needed to be done. Because that's what the best operators do. They don't seek glory or recognition. They simply show up when needed, execute the mission with professional excellence, and move on to the next challenge. Aria Bennett was that kind of operator. And somewhere in the world, there would always be another impossible mission waiting for someone with the courage to face it alone. Thanks for watching. Every woman has a story worth telling. Join us to hear them all.